Hi, I'm Professor Larkin, and today we're going to continue to talk about incentive design within organizations. And as we discussed, incentives are about a lot more than rewards and punishments. Incentive systems link authority, the job we give to employees, and accountability, the rewards and punishments that we give them. And the way that we link those two is through performance measurement. In our last video, we talked about the link between job design and performance measurement. Today we're going to talk about the link between performance measurement and rewards and punishments. To kick off the discussion, let's first talk about the criteria for incentive system success. And there's two fundamental criteria that determine whether or not your incentive system is going to succeed or fail. The first criteria is what's known as alignment. And alignment means whether or not the incentive system motivates employees to act in ways that add value. With misaligned incentives, with incentives that cause employees to act in value-destroying ways, you're going to find that employees are undertaking actions which are at odds with what your company's strategy is. The second criteria for success is what we call controllability. And that means the extent to which the employee feels like she can control the performance factor for which she's being rewarded. Without controllability, incentives simply aren't strong because the employee will feel like, sure, I get paid if X, Y, or Z happens, but I can't control any of those factors. And so you optimally want to have incentives that are both highly aligned, which causes employees to act in ways that are consistent with what your organization is trying to do, and that are controllable, that employee feels like I can affect the outcome, and therefore I can affect my pay. The problem is alignment and controllability often are at odds with each other. And we can see this if we look at different potential measures of performance for an employee. From broad measures like the stock price of a company to very, very narrow measures such as an employee's individual performance on a certain variable. Let's consider a broad measure first, like stock price. We could say to employees, we're going to pay you more if the company's stock price goes higher. What incentive does that give the employee? Well, those are very, very aligned incentives. An employee is going to think, I only want to act in a way that's going to increase the stock price. And the stock price of your company is fundamentally tied to the value that's creating. So very, very high alignment, but low controllability. Most employees outside of the very high levels in an organization aren't going to feel like their day-to-day actions are going to affect the stock price of the company. So you have very high alignment. In theory, an employee will only act in ways that are going to increase the stock price, which means they're only going to act in ways that create value. But there's no strong incentive at all because they simply can't control the price of the stock on a day-to-day basis. Let's think now about the bottom of the funnel. We incentivize our employees only based on their individual performance. How much output they make in a certain month. How many sales they make, what their research productivity was. They certainly feel like they have more control over that measure, but they also have the opportunity to manipulate their performance on that measure in ways that aren't necessarily good for the company. And we'll talk about an example of that in just a minute. Very narrow measures of performance are very highly controllable by an employee, but they may not be aligned with the value-creating strategic mission of an organization. So narrow measures are great for controllability, but are oftentimes weak for alignment. So to summarize, firms face a trade-off. With very, very broad measures of performance, you get weak incentives, but aligned incentives. With narrow measures, you get very strong incentives, but they are distorted. So let's think about this 30 minutes or its free delivery guarantee across the two criteria for incentive system success that we've talked about, controllability and alignment. It's certainly controllable for delivery drivers. They can directly affect how quickly their customers get their pizzas. So that's a good thing. But how highly aligned is it with Domino's goals of profitability? Well, let's look at what happened. Yes, the drivers could control how quickly their customers got pizzas, but sometimes they'd make mistakes. The death rate for Domino's delivery drivers in the 1980s, 50 out of every 100,000 drivers died. Terrible thing. And a benchmark, construction industry, which is a very, very dangerous industry in the US, it has almost half the rate of death. This was a very, very dangerous incentive that was introduced. It was too controllable, and it caused employees to act in ways that destroyed value. Not only did the drivers pass away, but a lot of innocent bystanders were killed as well. In 1992, they settled the lawsuit that was brought by the family of a delivery driver, killed by a delivery driver. Other lawsuits came through, and Domino's was paying millions of dollars in settlements, and they finally had to discontinue the program, despite the fact that their employees loved it because it could give them higher tips, and their customers loved it because it meant they were more likely to get a pizza more quickly. It was too narrow of a measure with too high of a potential for distortion. So this is a good example of misaligned incentives. Incentives that are very, very powerful because they're so controllable, but they're almost too powerful because the distortions that they can lead to were very, very negative. So coming back to the fundamental trade-off of incentives, Domino's problem was that it gave incentives that were so narrow that it led to distortion. And we would hope that most incentives aren't going to cause problems as deep as Domino's. Domino's incentives led to deaths, which is obviously a terrible thing, but incentives fundamentally, when they're very strong, are often very distortive as well and lead to value destroying activities by employees. And so just as so often the lesson when it comes to incentive design, companies need to think about the trade-offs between strong incentives and aligned incentives. Now let's turn to the opposite side of the coin and think about punishment. When should managers punish for poor behavior as opposed to reward for positive behavior? Well, one fundamental lesson is that there is a role for punishment. Good managers do need to know when to punish, and a lot of managers don't like to punish, and they're not punishing as much as they should. When should you punish? Well, you want to punish when an employee doesn't meet fundamental expectations which have been set already. It's really, really important that if an employee isn't meeting fundamental rules, that you punish him or her. It's a much more powerful method to correct fundamentally poor behavior than not giving a reward. What makes a punishment effective? Well, there's a couple of different criteria that tend to make punishments more effective. First of all, it needs to be immediate. You don't want to delay punishments in response to negative behavior. You don't want to go away and think about it and come back a few weeks later. Immediate punishments send a much more powerful message. Second, it needs to be based on established rules. The employee needs to understand that there was a rule established, you broke it, and therefore you're going to be punished. It can't be something that's done ex post based on rules that weren't clear from the outset. And the third is really important and is oftentimes forgotten about. Punishments are effective if it's costly to the manager as well as to the employee, because it really sends the message that you care. You're not giving the punishment as a way to be punitive towards the employee, a way to make them suffer, but as a way to get them to correct their behavior. So what's an example of a costly punishment for the manager? Telling the employee that you have to put in extra time for this task, but I'm going to stay with you for that and give you feedback based on it. You're going to take the time to make sure that the employee improves his or her performance based on it. You don't want to just say, go and do this and then show me your work later, because that's going to feel punitive. It's going to feel like you're doing it just to make that person suffer. But if you show the employee that you're going to suffer along with them as a way to get them back to acting in value-creating ways, the message is that much more effective. So what we learned today in incentive system design is that once again we're thinking about trade-offs. There's a fundamental trade-off between incentive alignment and incentive intensity. Aligned incentives are oftentimes broad, but that means they're not intense. That means they're not strong incentives. Strong incentives are oftentimes misaligned. They're not aligned with an organizational goal. You need to think about those two trade-offs. Every incentive system has benefits and costs, and there's no perfect system, just like there's no perfect manager. And no system allows managers to completely align employee actions and organizational goals. It's a difficult, mistake-prone process. And finally, punishments probably should be used more in organizations, and they're most effective when they're immediate, rules-based, and costly to the giver. So if we think about what we've learned about organizations as a whole across these different videos, there's a couple of different themes that I'd like you to take away. How can you be an effective manager? The first, we've said trade-off across these videos hundreds of times, and that's because being a manager is not easy. Every decision involves trade-offs, and you have to think about actions and outcomes in a cost-benefit framework. Nothing is free and nothing is easy. And so thinking about the trade-offs of different activities is very, very important. So a trade-off driven mentality is fundamental. The second piece, which is really, really important, is having that gold medal mentality. And that means oftentimes being dissatisfied, looking for what you could have done better. If you have that gold medal mentality, yes, you're going to be disappointed because you're going to be focused on how you could have improved. But if you continue to improve with the gold medal mentality, you will win some gold medals sometimes. And that's the ultimate goal.